And yes, we got everybody here.
Yeah.
All right. So as y'all can see,
So good to see you.
as y'all can see, we're gonna go ahead and get to rolling. This is a bit of a reunion for those of you. These are some of my favorite people in terms of education. We've done a lot of stuff together, but it's been some years. So certainly just really excited. But I'm going to allow them. I guess I'll say a little bit about me. Tim and Wes, he and his. I am based in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where I was born. Grew up in Arkansas. I taught for about 15 years, mostly ELA. There's a little bit of background, so I'm not sure if someone can or needs to mute. Okay. Yep, I think that helped. There we go. Okay, so yeah, but raised mostly in Arkansas, so a lot of roots in the South. Went to college in North Carolina, but I did teach for 15 years, mostly in ELA, high school, 9th and 10th grade. A lot of people find them difficult. I love 9th and 10th graders. That's my niche. And I've also done some college teaching. I've been LGBTQ plus community initiative senior managing director at Teach for America since 2014. I am not a Teach for America alum, but I have three amazing alum joining me here. And I think that, for all that is said about Teach for America, it's these three people that I always bring to my mind when I know that, like, hey, the institution has still got a lot of work to do, but they have produced some really amazing educators who I'm proud, I will ride and die for whenever and wherever, because they are really bringing it. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Again, continue to use the chat. And just tell us a little bit about yourself as a school leader and your relationship to the movement to nurture what I call safe and brave schools. So let's start with you, Allecyn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, everybody can hear me? My name is Allecyn Gay Howard. I am currently one of the assistant principals at McFarland Middle School in Washington, D.C., and the founder of Alexander Howard Education Consultants. I have been in education. I'm going into my 13th school year. I've been in leadership for 8 years. I made the decision my second year teaching to not advertise, not deny, because I was in the South. I started my core year in South Louisiana, and it was very hit or miss with, oh, you might get fired, a lot of that back and forth. And then my second to third year teaching, I decided I needed to be who my kids needed me, who I needed when I was growing up. And so I just decided to step out into my authentic self for whatever it was worth. I know a lot of people are told, like, wait till you're good at teaching. But that sometimes removes the qualitative value of just being you at all times. And so I have been in DC. I'm going into my third year in Washington, DC. I've spent most of my educational career working in the South, what some will consider the deep South. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. So that is where I am and where I've been. So I continue to show up and do this work so that my soon to be three Black boys, have two downstairs and one on the way, can get the education I want them to have, right? So making sure that their story is recognized in whatever school that they're in. And so I do this work for them. But I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Tim, for having me, as always.
And I realized I didn't give a lot of context for myself, but as a part to back up a little bit of introduction, part of why I do this work and my inspiration is I was a Black boy, queer boy in Southwest Arkansas, straight passing, I guess, as they say. I was an athlete and a good student. And for all that was going well for me, I had a suicide attempt when I was 16. I just wanted one teacher, somebody in my school setting, to affirm that I was okay. And I think that the ability to become a teacher, to be the educator that I needed, was something that was so important for me. And I saw the impact, especially in those schools. There were schools I worked at that was like, you better not come out, right? But there were schools that I worked at that were really thankful and grateful that I was willing to sort of reveal a bit of who I was and the impact that that had on the kids, like the way that they saw each other, the respect that they had for the LGBT community was in some way shaped by my leadership and my ability to kind of reveal who I was to students. So thank you for sharing that and reminding me to say a little bit more about myself. I'm going to move on to Dymir.
Feels like I'm at home talking to y'all. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. It's good to see y'all. I'm Dymir Arthur. I'm originally from Camden, New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia, and grew up in New Jersey, always outside of Philly, Camden County, Gloucester County. I went to Rutgers, New Brunswick, New Jersey, and started my career in education as a TFA corps member back in '09 in the greater Philadelphia region, sometimes called Mid-Atlantic, depending on who you're talking to from the TFA marketing team. But I've been in school leadership. This is my 8th year. So I moved to New York back in 2011 after doing the corps, and I actually worked for Teach for America for 2 years as a director of alumni affairs, and then became a school leader, first a dean of students. I taught in high school, but when I became a school leader, I went to middle school. I just found that there was this misconception that students in middle school didn't really know themselves. They weren't wrestling with big picture questions about life, and they were still so young that they didn't really understand the world. And I discovered very quickly that that is just not true. And a lot of the issues that my high school students, when I was a teacher, were dealing with had a lot to do with experiences they had that they did not fully understand or did not feel supported through when they were in middle school and sometimes elementary school. So I've been a dean of students, an academic dean for math and science, and then a principal in the charter world. I'm now the head of school for the Academy of Thought and Industry, which is a private school startup for teens and middle school students who want to succeed on their own terms based on the Montessori model. And I think what really has driven me to do this work is my identity as a Black man, as a Black gay man, but also as a survivor of sexual assault. I dealt with a very traumatic experience when I was 16, and because I wasn't out, I didn't have someone to talk to about that experience and couldn't find support. And so I think of my job as being one where it's not just about setting the conditions within schools for children to feel safe, but often my job has been helping parents figure out how to support their children on their journey. I have found that a lot of students, whether they are 10 or they're 17, if they don't have a home where a parent understands what they're going through and what they need, they can sometimes turn inward and really, really struggle, or turn to external sources of validation and find themselves in harmful situations. And so a lot of my work as a school leader has been around helping parents support their LGBTQ youth. And I'm just excited to be here with y'all today. I really appreciate this.
For sharing that.
Yeah,
I really appreciate you just like sharing that out.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, Allecyn was probably reacting like I was, like, whoa, like how did they put that like in a conversation? We didn't talk about that at brunch, but nah, seriously, that was powerful for me, and I had never thought about that as a reason that it is important to have an environment where our kids feel safe. Some of them have experienced deep trauma and not feeling like you can have someone to talk to. I mean, imagine coming from a situation like that and having someone give a homophobic comment. I mean, like, it can literally just take someone from that's on the edge of feelings, trying to stay stable. It can send them over that edge. And I hadn't really even thought about that aspect of it. And all the work I do, it's just I get another compelling reason that we need to do this work. And so thank you for sharing your story. Elena, I'm going to introduce you a little bit differently because we got to be on a panel. There was a White House summit to support African-American LGBT youth back in the other administration where such a thing was allowed at the White House. We should just name that. And got to be on a panel. And I didn't really know Elena at the time, but I just really appreciated as an ally to our community, the openness and the courage to just be able to say, like, you know what, in my early time as a leader, I probably didn't get it right. I did some things that were probably pretty messed up. And I think I've always welcomed you to spaces like this because I think not all of our leaders start at the place where we need to be. I made some mistakes in my classrooms that were probably harmful to LGBTQ students. And I need to be able to own that because we are all brought up in this world, in this atmosphere. We're where like racism and homophobia and transphobia are just kind of the things that we're swimming in. So with that, I just want to welcome you and allow you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. That's my spiel, folks. That's my story. Timon just, that was it. I think, so thank you so much for having me. I'll start by saying that, and I'm always happy to join. I know Allecyn well, Timon, nice to meet you as well, Dymir. But I think this is a really important conversation for school leaders. And so I just have to say thank you for the invite again and for always thinking of me. I'm Elena Bell. I am in Washington, D.C. currently as a principal of Tacoma Education Campus. And I've been a school principal now. This is going into my 11th year. Originally from Atlanta, I was TFA Core Atlanta, all those great times back then. And so I'm still happy to rep my home, although I am here in DC. And so I think Timon named it best. I think as school leaders and teachers, when we commit to education, you're hard pressed to find folks who say, I don't believe in all kids and that I'm not going to commit to keeping all kids safe, right? I think we have great intentions. And so I am committed to this work as an ally because I care about all kids, and all means all. And I think sometimes when we say that, we don't necessarily think about every single individual group that might experience all of the ills of just not being able to show up as their true selves. And I think sometimes as privileged people, right? So being heterosexual could be a privilege, right? And so I think we may need, we also have blind spots. And so I come to this space as a school leader who is a caring adult, always reflecting on all means all, and always committed to getting it right for students. And I think Timon spoke to earlier in my career, I always think about this one student. When I was in Chicago Public Schools, I was a principal of a PK-8 school, and there was a student who came to me bravely and confidently. And I always think about him because I didn't show up for him how I wish I would now, right? And so I've made this commitment since then. I still talk to him, his ball. Since then, to make sure that I am learning and growing in how I show up and in how I create a safe space, particularly for Black LGBTQ students, and ensuring that all of the other adults in my building do the same. And very similar to how, I go hard on, equity work and anti-racist work, right? But we need to put that same energy into how we support safe spaces and inclusive spaces for our LGBTQ students and staff. And so that has been my commitment, and I am still learning and growing, which is why I'm always hitting up my folks and always willing to share. And thank you again for having me, and I look forward to this conversation.
I'm on mute. I was getting into the chat. I love this. I mean, the chat that's happening, the amens, the affirmations, yes, and teachers and staff and families. And I think I was thinking about this a minute ago. I've seen spaces where there are conversations about what it means to support LGBT students, but at schools where they don't allow faculty to be out, where they don't encourage staff to be out. And I think we send a mixed message when we say, well, be yourself. It's okay to be yourself and be affirmed, but a student can't point to one adult in the building who is LGBTQ, who is Black, who is thriving, because people won't allow that. And so I want us to think about that contradiction. And I think even as school leaders, we are in positions often when we are influencing the hiring of teachers, where we are influencing who we bring into the situations. Our Black school leaders thinking, you know what? It would really be great to have an excellent teacher who identifies as part of the LGBT community as a part of the school, or who identifies as trans as a part of the school, because our students need to see that. They need to see themselves reflected I mean, I remember finding out years later that James Baldwin was gay. Like, and I was like, mind blown. Like, if I had even known that one simple fact of being able to point to a successful, thriving, intelligent, brilliant Black person who was in the LGBT community, it would have greatly impacted how I saw myself. So I'm really excited about this next question because we're going to talk about the Blackness, right? And this is an interesting thing for me because oftentimes the Black community is characterized, and I might say, I'll just own my stuff, I say sometimes mischaracterized as being more homophobic or more transphobic than other communities, right? And I've heard that like, oh, Black people are so homophobic. For my panelists, do you think it's true? And secondly, what are challenges and opportunities for building a climate of acceptance and affirmation in Black school communities, and inclusive of our students, our teachers, and our parents? I'll just say first, just kind of own my voice and opinion that, you know, it took me 17, 18 years to really come to the point where I could talk to my family about who I was. And parents also have their own coming out process. So like, we don't struggle with this for years and then tell them and they're at the Pride Parade the next day. So that's probably happened for a few people, right? But that didn't happen in my case. But my parents have now gotten to a place where they, through knowledge and through understanding and through just having someone proximate to them who identified as part of the community, where they have gone on their own coming out journeys as parents of a queer Black man. And so I think that narrative that like Black people keep their kids out, Black people are so unaccepting, I just want us to challenge that, because Black people aren't funding with billions of dollars the campaigns to take our rights away. And we don't talk about that being homophobic too, right? Like that homophobia shows up in a lot of different ways. And yeah, like my cousin said, he don't like gay folks, but he just ate Aunt Shirley's pie at the picnic and he loves her and her partner, right? And I think Black people just show up differently when it comes to homophobia. And we have to take that cultural thing and look at it very differently than taking a white dominant cultural narrative and sort of placing it on the Black community. So curious, let's start with you, Elena. You finished up the last time. I'm curious about this.
So I think whenever we talk about Black folks being more or less of anything, right? It's almost like this trigger that I think about where folks say, oh, Black women are more aggressive. We are more, you know, when we're expressing ourselves, we can be, you know, thought of as angry, or we're more sexual or more sexualized, right? And so I think we have to really think about how we accept what people say about us, but also challenge in our spaces what we allow to be said among us, right, about ourselves. And so it's like this constant interrupting that we're doing outside, but also inside. What I will say is that there, you know, I believe what happens in the Black community as far as being more homophobic or more this or that happens in white communities as well, right? But I do believe that, and I've had, you know, I principal a pretty diverse school community. So I get to see and coach and support all families, right? Who may be who of course want to support their student, or their students who are struggling with their identity, or if it's middle school, high school, sexuality. And I think that it is not a more or less thing. It's all about how you kind of see yourself, how you experience, and then how you interrupt those things that you know are not healthy ideals of how we see ourselves in the community. And so I think that's the main thing that I think folks struggle with when we talk about how to create safe spaces, is like that internal, it's almost cultural, right? And like you're undoing cultural mindsets and norms, generations, right? And so as leaders and teachers and students, you're having to check your mom and dad on what they think or say, right, in your own household. or be sensitive to how that impacts you, and being brave. And I use the word brave because I always say our students are brave, right? They just need us to show up just as bravely as they are. And that's where we're missing the mark. And so I just kind of want to pour into that and not, continue to recreate that negative narrative of who we are, but to challenge who we are by showing up as our best selves and affirming the good, the bad, the ugly of who we are, because that's the same that's happening in other communities.
Awesome. Allecyn, why don't you speak to this question?
This question, I go back to your idea of the oppression Olympics, right? And it's like, are we minimizing our Blackness? Are we minimizing our queerness? Like, who do we need to show up as today in order to fit in this space? And even thinking about some of the things that Elena mentions, like if I type intersectionality into Microsoft right now, it's still underlined in red, right? And so we are not teaching what it really means to be intersectional. For us to be Black women, for us to be queer Black women or queer Black men, or just queer Black people, like getting rid of the gender that comes with it. And so I think until we as a community embrace those, Audre Lorde, Baldwin, who set that standard and really lift that up in everything that we do, then it's always going to be this narrative where, oh, Black people don't accept their own kind. That was not my experience. It was a perceived experience for me growing up, to be closeted for such a long time. However, had I just talked to my parents and just like named that this is what I was dealing with, I would have been okay, right? Like my parents never, I will say I am privileged, I am lucky, however you want to name it, that my parents always loved and embraced me. But I think when kids don't know or don't have models of what's possible, called possibility models, for their life and their structure beyond K-12 education, even in college, right? I went to an HBCU, and when I first got there, it was don't be out. We're in the South, don't be out. Like you got to watch what you say, who you said. And eventually I just got over it because I needed to be my full self. So I think as we think about the Black community and we think about it being homophobic or not, I believe as we continue to move into this radical space, that's what I'll call it, right now in our country, the more voices we have to speak out, to more people we invite in as allies and co-conspirators, I feel like that narrative will fall to the wayside, and it'll be like, no, this is their intersection. Like they are all of this at one time, and that's okay. So not here for the oppression Olympics. I work with a very diverse group of people, and I never choose who I show up as at work. And I hope that my students are learning that they don't have to do so either.
Listen, I want you to speak to that, letting people in, because I think when we talk about culture and different paradigms, for those that might be interested, I wrote an open letter to Frank Ocean back that seems like a long time ago now, right? Remember when he first, quote unquote, came out? And in my open letter, I shared something that my friend Karamo Brown, if you watch Queer Eye, shared with me, which was like this. He was really trying to interrogate this notion of coming out. And really, because when you come out, it's like the person doing something to people as opposed to this idea of letting people in, right? Like I'm not doing anything by being myself. I'm inviting people into who I am, right? And I was like, that's really powerful, right? And if people, when you invite people in, if they reject you, the onus is on them, right? The issue is it's not you not, doing something wrong. It's them making a decision not to accept who you actually are. And I think that that's a real interesting shift. And it's one of the ways that we can reclaim a different cultural paradigm for looking at Black communities and how we show up, right? And for some of our families, like it took me to be an adult and go back to Arkansas to realize, oh, Cousin Bill had a lover. I didn't even know, like, 'cause when you don't see it, you just don't know. But then you go back and you're like, oh, like Black queerness was all around me, and I just did not have a lens to see it at that time. And I think Bell Hooks said this in one of her earlier books, that like Black queer folks, as I call them, have always been a critical part of Black communities, of Black upliftment. If you look at the Harlem Renaissance or the Black arts movement, our civil rights, and Bayard Rustin, we've always been here. It's just sometimes not naming that, as you say, Allecyn. Dymir, why don't you talk?
Yes, Jen, I also love Bell Hooks. Two of her books, All About Love and then The Will to Change Men, Masculinity, and Love, saved me. This question is so fascinating because I could write a whole book about this one question. I would say the question is complicated, and I believe the question, it's one that's been posed long before this conversation, right? But it's problematic in that it assumes that the Black community is a monolith, and it's not. And I think we have to recognize that in the same way that people's fears about homosexuality or anything that is not gender conforming or heteronormative, what is at the root of the fear is very varied. I think that every parent, every person who gives birth to a family wants the next generation to be better, wants the next generation to be stronger. What that means is that the next generation does not struggle in some ways that the previous generation had to struggle. So, for example, I'm the son of a Bermudian Caribbean woman and a Black African-American man. Their struggles with my sexuality when I came out at 17 were grounded in radically different sort of conceptions of what it meant to be successful that had very little to do with being homophobic. I read it as being homophobic when I was 17, 18, 19, even into my early 20s. I read it as my parents come from this homophobic culture, but what I actually realized from my mother, being a Bermudian woman who moved to the States, had children, and then is trying to raise them often by herself, her fear is, how do I, as a single Black woman, raise a young man to be successful and strong and autonomous in a white dominant culture? He is Black. Now he is also gay. And so the way that she responded to me coming out was not really about her being homophobic. It was her being afraid that she could not protect me as a Black gay man in a white predominant culture, right? For my father, his conception of what it meant to be a man and to have a son. He had two daughters. He is deceased, so God rest his soul, but he had two daughters and one son. The son is supposed to be the one to carry on the family's name. And so his idea of having a son means that I'm the next person in our family, in his lineage, to carry forth this tradition of what it means to be a Black man in this country, to have autonomy, to have power, to have a sense of an entrepreneurial spirit. And something about me being gay conflicts with that concept. And so it took a lot of work for the two of them to be able to accept me, but I wouldn't say that was homophobic. And sometimes we read it as such, and it actually is something much deeper than that. So I think when we talk about the Black community, we have to look at what is at the root of our fears. And when you're talking about people who've been oppressed for over 400 years, have been systematically shut out, and they're trying to do better and trying to grow, anything that comes up against that might seem like a strike against you or another struggle you have to overcome is very difficult for people to process. That is not to say that there are not people in the Black community who are homophobic. There are. But a lot of it is rooted in fear. And I discovered that for myself being a school leader in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, where 80% of my families came from Trinidad and St. Lucia and Jamaica and sometimes other countries like, Nigeria. And educators, sometimes white educators who came out and were gay but struggled in the classroom would say, oh, the children are homophobic. And I would have to correct them and help them understand you have gay children sitting in your classroom, but you would never know it. It's not that they're homophobic, it's that you don't give clear directions. You're not fair. You're disrespectful in your tone. And so I think that when we think about the Black community, we have to be very careful how we talk about it and look at what is at the root. It does exist, but it's much more complicated than just saying the Black community is homophobic.
You said a word. Thank you for that. I mean, because I do think that we misname where certain things are coming from based on presupposed notions. I had a white educator in the Boston arena tell me that she didn't correct Black boys in her class for using no homo and pause and saying homophobic things because it was a part of their culture. And I told her how racist that was, right? Because if those were white children, you would have felt it was appropriate to correct them, to create a safe space. And so the idea that you don't correct Black children when they're saying something homophobic because it's their was racially offensive to me, right? And so I think if there are white educators on this call, like, do not misname or misappropriate what you're seeing, because that is not overwhelmingly the way that we are. And I also have experienced creating a safer classroom culture in my class where the has shifted, right? So much that when a new student came into our class and used the F word with another student, one of the young men in my class said, "Yo, we don't do that here." And the guy was like, "Oh, I'm sorry," because the norm had been created that like, this is not how we operate. And that as Black people, we take care of each other, right? And what is that? What does like radical care in our classrooms and our schools look like? It looks like safety. And I think if anything, in terms of decolonizing our experiences in schools and classrooms, Black people have an opportunity to get it right in ways that other people have not, right? I kind of selfishly want our Black schools to be leaders around brave and safe space work, because I feel like, you know, we can push against that colonized white dominant mindset and create a different way of operating and functioning with each other. Definitely starting to see some questions. I'm going to ask really quick, and I'm just ask people to give maybe one example in terms of brave school work. It's not just about the social-emotional components, but also curriculum design and like things that we can do in terms of how we are designing learning. Can each of you give me maybe one example of something we can do in our schools that can affirm Black LGBTQ students? And we'll start with you.
Plus one. Okay,
Just one.
I would say, I think two things have to be true. One, for our students who identify as LGBTQ+, they have to know that they are not alone. And so it's important to create spaces for them to come together and be able to support one another and recognize that what you are experiencing is common. It is not something that makes you seem other. You are a human, and your humanity deserves to be acknowledged. And that's coming together with other adults who identify and other students as often as possible, creating that space for them so that they know that they're not alone. For their peers, and I think this is starting to get a little bit to the question that Jamal Thomas was asking. I have seen a lot of schools make the mistake. I believe this is a mistake, and if you're an educational leader, you might strongly disagree with me, and we should have a conversation about it. I have seen schools, though, recognize that a child has a belief that they do not agree with and punish the child for it. And I do not believe, as a principal, I have my own political views, my own spiritual views, but it's not my job as an educator to change your child's mind. And what I mean by that is I have had to have conversations with young men and young women who may have said something that was homophobic, who may have said something that was problematic. And instead of saying you're suspended because you don't believe in homosexuality, it's a conversation around how do you have your beliefs and still maintain a sense of dignity and respect for others. And that's part of the conversation that is missing. The children who identify have to know they're not alone. They have to know that we have been here since the dawn of time, and we will continue to be here. And there are people who look like them who also will love like them. And there has to be some conversations with students who may not identify but have beliefs, whether they're grounded in politics or religion, and know that your views, there is value to those and we respect them, but you also have to respect that there are people who do not agree with you. And as long as we can create that space, I think that I have seen students be more welcoming and accepting of one another, recognizing that we disagree, but we commit to a sense of love and justice for a community. And I think that we have just not been able to get there because people get into these very punitive modes, and there's one end of the spectrum that they sort of get into this corner and think the other side is wrong, and they're not willing to engage in the work If you are an educator, your job is to help teach. And that's not just teaching the curriculum, it's teaching children to understand that they live in a world that is incredibly diverse and they can have their beliefs, but they have to respect other people's.
Love that. And I think you did a good job of responding to Jamal's question. So we may circle back to it. But Allecyn, why don't you tell us maybe something in terms of your school, the design, the curriculum that can affirm our.
I don't like to use targeted times of the year, but we do celebrate Pride Month at our school. And in doing so, when the materials go up for Black History Month, we leave them up, but we make sure that there's representation. There's a scavenger hunt where kids can go and explore. And so you have the Bayard Rustins, you have the Audre Lorde, you have these people posted in our school. So kids can stop and explore. And granted, this is when we were in a physical space. And so moving into this school year, knowing that we have to cut back on some of the things that we would do in person, we've taken a look at our curriculum and just making sure that there's more representation than has been in the past. And so as long as the themes, if you will, align, right? Because I still have a job to do. As long as the themes align, we're making sure that the characters in the stories that our students are reading are representative of a much broader society. And so that is something that we started in the spring. And as we kick off the school year next week, we're making sure that we highlight that and we're having input and voice from our students and our staff members as we roll out these changes.
Added in, just thinking about the virtual space, something that I also want to own and acknowledge that a lot of our kids, a lot of our babies have been, because of the pandemic, in environments, if they have homophobic parents or toxic environments, they may be hyper exposed to trauma, right? Because imagine that school is the safest place. Imagine that going to Allecyn's school or Dymir's school or Elena's school are the safest places a kid has in the course of their day. And then because of the pandemic, being denied access to that space. So I want our teachers and our administrators and faculty to think about that as we're moving into another school year. I think now is the time where we need to be even more vigilant about ensuring that kids feel affirmed and respected. So you next, Elena.
Yeah, I think all of those are really, really powerful examples of change in schools. One of the most powerful examples that I have committed to, and this is hands down, who I hire matters. The people in front of my students matter. When I wanted to decrease the achievement gap, and I knew my achievement gap was black and brown boys, I hired more men of color, right? If I want to create safe and inclusive spaces for students, LGBTQ plus students, I'm hiring LGBTQ plus staff, right? Because that level of diversity and care and compassion and experience and connection for me is the bang for my buck, right? That means, of course, as an ally and as other allies in the building, we have a commitment and a duty. But we are also have a commitment and a duty to learn, but we have a commitment and a duty to ensure that there's diversity in our building. And when you have that space, it opens up an opportunity for you to learn, for everyone to learn together. But it really opens up an opportunity for students to see themselves in the building and for them to know that there is a caring adult in that space that gets them and sees them and has their journey, and it has that same shared journey, if you will. And so bang for my buck, and I take a great pride in who I hire in my classrooms and what does my leadership staff look like, right? On my team, my assistant principals, it is diverse. And so I think when you have that at the leadership level, then our policies can fall through and be aligned. The types of books that we buy that represent the characters in our school community, that's aligned, because who's ordering the books? A Black woman, a gay Black man, right? Who is curriculum? Who's determining what we about to learn? Right? Like, so I think that is really important, and that helps. It helps us align our values to what we want for students every day. And it's like a checkpoint, right? I've been told, hey, Belle, check your bias, right? Because I've got that person on my team where we have that level of understanding in that safe space where we're all learning. Belle, check your bias right here, right? You might, let's take this back and let's like make sure that what we say we are gonna do is what we are doing for students. And then in that same realm, I've been really proud of, I'll name DCPS for putting policy in at the school, at the central office level around honoring students' civil rights. Who they say they are is who they are. And we don't get to feel some kind of way about that, right? And so when it's coming from the central office space in terms of like straight up policy, now I also have something where I can say, this is policy. This is, if you don't, I don't want to challenge your values, right? I will, but you know, this is now policy. So if you don't want to get on the values level, and that's you take your time and you learn and grow personally and inwardly, but this is the policy. And as a school, this is what we do to support kids and families. And that is a non-negotiable. So I think the adults in the building and taking real care about who you have in front of kids and who interacts with families is really powerful.
And what I'll say, because I know we might have educators who are not in areas as fortunate as New York or Washington, D.C. that actually have policy. And I would say, like, to your point, if you are like, know the policies of your district, right? Because you can actually leverage the policies that may be affirming in a school setting where you're getting pushback. And then you pretty much just say, hey, like, this is just the policy, right? However, if you do not have those policies, maybe at the federal level or the municipal level or whatever, schools can create policies within the school. They can create norms. One strategy that I always use is like, look at any school's mission statement. Most of them are going to say, we provide an environment where all children feel affirmed, and their learning is succeeding, right? And I always say, like, use your school's policy against your school. When they want to push back and say, oh, we don't support this or that. Well, hold on, your whole slogan says all children, right? And I think it's important. Like, I would always do that. I'd bring it back to a value that they've had. Going to your school values. What is your school saying? These are our values around education, and like flipping that and say, well, hold on, you just, did this to this student, or you said this to this student. Does that live into the values of our school? And I think that's a really important way to align with some greater principle that people have agreed to. I want to take some questions, and actually for the panelists, we do have that final question. I want to circle back to that at the very end as we close out. So I want you to be thinking about that. But let's open it up to some audience or questions. We're reading the chat. Please go ahead and feel free to direct it to any individual or to us as a group. I got a feeling everybody's typing a lot, and then we're gonna get like 10 questions at one time. Let's go. I know the chat's been active, so I'm sure there's some questions that are brewing.
I did see a question earlier, just in regards to regionality and how policies are.
Oh, okay.
Alexa asks, how much does geography impact one's ability to show up in schools? I think about New York and DC being a very different space than a Texas or Georgia. And I'll jump in only because now I've grown. I did K-12 in Georgia, and I did most of my leading and teaching in the South, and now I'm in DC. I think it depends on the school leader more than anything. I have always had school leaders who allow me to be myself. And in being myself, I advocate for kids and what I needed growing up. And so I think it really depends on the school leader. Yes, there are policies at the district level, as Elena has alluded to. But if your school leader is just doing the job of the policy, then that's not going to translate to the school. They actually have to believe it. And so for core members, if you are coaching teachers or if you're in school leadership, it's all about that individual being able to have a conversation, so to speak, without necessarily outing themselves, if that's not where they are comfortable, about what they actually believe is best for children. Does all really mean, oh, what does this look like? And I think having that conversation on the front end allows for a person to better show up as themselves. I'll also go back to something that Tim said. Who Teach for America partners with is important. If we want to have a more diverse teaching body, then as an organization, we have to be mindful of those dollars and cents that are coming in to support the teaching body. So I think it's a both and. It's like a core member can't impact who you all partner with. However, as an organization, you can start to examine those people and again, those dollars to make sure that those who need to be in front of kids are actually in front of kids.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, I also want to speak to another question around intersectionality. And this is just to, I was fully aware of my privilege as a cisgender, masculine of center Black man who people didn't know was queer unless I said something. And I realized that allowed me to be in spaces and places that my more effeminate brothers could not be. I was a varsity basketball coach as well at a school in DC. And so it's kind of like, how do we also notice that within our community of Black queer folks, that there are differences in terms of our intersectionality. And some of us have a bit more privilege in spaces and ways that others do not. And I think that's really important. But what that means for me is as a cisgender Black man, am I creating space for the transgender teacher who is not going to be welcomed as favorably sometimes, right? So I think it's how do we exercise our privilege and power as people who can influence and make space for those who will not have that same. I just want to read a question out loud. Anyone can take it. It's from Charity. What are specific structures, supports that have been made available to families around supporting their LGBTQIA2S plus students? What programming or professional development are provided to educators who do not identify and want to be allies and co-conspirators in this work? Great question. We'd love to hear from some of you.
I'll take the question from the allies and co-conspirators standpoint and be honest in that there aren't very many professional development opportunities specifically for leaders to support LGBTQ plus families and students. It is a personal commitment that I feel like you have to make as a school leader, just as I want, there are some school leaders who want to, grow in their race and equity work, right? There are some school leaders who might want to grow in other areas. This is a space to say, I want to support and have a brave and safe community for my students and families. What do I have to do? And you've got to do the work. So that's one area. But then I think DC, I'm just going to name, we're also in a different district. So, me and Allecyn could go to central office and say, hey, we need some supports here. And where is this conversation? And where are the resources? There are lots of people at central office like, we need supports here. And I think in saying that, it is that tug or that red light to say, this is a gap in if we want to do this work right, we need to support our leaders and families, and then they come to create it. But it has to be like a proactive space. And unfortunately, I feel like many of us are reactive when we have an instance of a parent coming to you with a concern or a student concern, and you're not quite sure how to handle it. So I would like to, of course, see more proactive approaches. But I haven't found that Allecyn might find something different, but I'm like, I have to go out, I have to call people, I have to read, I have to I got a good network of folks, but I mean, just like we say to, the white folks, the Black folks shouldn't be doing all the work, right? I want to do some heavy lifting, so I'm not just all of my friends in the struggle to help school me on how to be a better leader and a better ally. So I think there's a lot of ownership that needs to be had in that.
In terms of teacher development, there are two areas that I facilitated trainings on over the last couple of years. In the charter world, you just have way more flexibility in terms of PD, scope, and sequence. I was not satisfied with the charter role, which is why I now run a private school. Whole other conversation. But I would say there were two really critical development opportunities for teachers that I would encourage all schools to think about. One is that there has to be training very early on in the school year, and then it has to be consistently followed up. And that was one of the mistakes that I made, was not consistently building it into our model. We'll come back to is, what is the language we use when we're talking to students and the questions we ask them that signal assumptions and biases we may have about gender in our school building? So an example of that, and it's very small, but it matters, right, is watching the way that teachers will sometimes structure conversations or debates, girls versus boys. Well, let's take a survey and ask students how they identify. 3% of our student body does not identify with either gender. So how might that make them feel in the classroom? How does the young man who is struggling with his identity or to figure out how he wants to identify in the world, how might he respond when his Black male teacher is having a conversation with him about what it means to be a young man in the world, and in the context of like him having done something that was disrespectful or not responsible? You can have a conversation about responsibility and respect without having to get into a conversation around how a student identifies in terms of their gender or using language that makes assumptions. So language is very important, and one of the things that students often pick up on. That's one. The other thing that I noticed is, we were talking a little bit earlier about curriculum. I'm a person who believes that our curriculum in this country as a whole is just not good enough, and we should be doing more to diversify it across all content areas, not even just history and literature. And content only matters but so far. We need to have a conversation about how we then deliver that content. We still have innovative content that is being created every year by nonprofits or consultant firms, gets spit out to teachers in schools across the country who still use a traditional top-down model of intellectual development, where students will learn more about what to think as opposed to how to think. And what I would say related to that as it applies to this part of the conversation is PD for teachers around what happens when they're facilitating discussion and discourse in their classroom, and what biases do they have that influence that. So an example of that is I did a survey of male teachers and female teachers, but mostly male teachers, teachers who identify as males in the classroom, and watched how they were facilitating conversations. And what I noticed is every time they asked a question that was designed to get a new idea brought into the conversation, they asked a young man who identified as heterosexual. When they were asking questions that were designed to get someone to repeat something that was previously said, they turned their attention to young women or young men who identified as LGBTQ. So it's like, what are the underlying assumptions you have about the intellectual capacity of your students, and how does that play out in the conversation related to what questions you ask students? And I think that that's another part of teacher development that is missing.
Take one more question, and then I want to, in the last couple of minutes, have each of our people respond to one question, but it has to happen quick. Is there another question we haven't responded to? And the last question is good. So if you don't have one, we're going to move ahead because I want to make sure each of them get this in. My question, and hopefully I know this is being recorded. I'm excited to see it and share it because I think it's going to be such a good tool for people to turn back to around some of these conversations. But what is something you're curious about doing as a school leader that maybe you haven't tried? Offered sort of one way as a school leader that you are pushing yourself to be braver for the sake of our Black LGBTQIA2S+ students. So like, what's something that maybe you haven't tried? Like y'all are amazing and have been doing great work, but I'm thinking like, what is that thing you haven't quite done, you've been thinking about, that you want to push yourself to do to show up more bravely for your students? Anybody?
I think it kind of goes back to, for me, it goes back to what both Dymir and Elena hinted at. We talk about brave classrooms and brave spaces, but being more explicit in coaching around that. Like, we coach around the Blackness, the brownness, the equity, as it relates to race, but not coaching around those mindsets around gender in the classroom. I want to push myself personally this upcoming school year to do more of that, particularly in a virtual space where kids are going to be checking out a lot more, getting teachers to lean in both to that discomfort and uncertainty on how to proceed and how to get kids re-engaged, particularly those who might have some struggles around their identity.
I would say, and I'm being very transparent here, I think my push and curiosity would be how to really make sure that our curriculum is inclusive and reflective of LGBTQ plus plight, history, characters, people, like we talked about James Baldwin, right? Like you should not have been a damn near an adult, right, to like learn that. So how can that be a part when we're thinking about literacy and when we're reading poets and their work, that we do like dig into who are these people and how did their struggle or their plight influence the works that they're put out? I think we talk about the work and then we try to separate the parts of the people that are uncomfortable either. And I say this because it's important in terms of, you know, parents, the parent pushback, because this is different. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about this, or the teacher pushback. So I want to be more courageous around interrupting in that way.
And someone from the conference has just come in and to tell us to wrap it up, so I'll make this real quick. I would say for me, you know, we live in New York, my students and I, and I'm launching a separate school, which is virtual. So now I have kids joining my school here in New York from around the country, which is really fun. But we have thought about how to leverage museums and the science institutes in New York when it comes to the curriculum. I'm realizing that I've never thought about how to leverage the queer history that exists in our city when we think about educating our students. And I have a campus that's right in the East Village, and I just want to spend some time thinking about how to bring the community into the school and for us to get out into the community more, specifically related to issues within the LGBTQ community.
Because I was actually chatting in that one of the ways that I tried to do it is like knowing your core standards and like the standards that you're being asked to teach. You don't have to focus on something that's LGBT centered. But if you want a science lesson on biology, I know how to talk about biology in a way that affirms gender. That is beholden to the standards that I also need to teach. So it's also like being really creative around like, how do we get to what we need to get to? You know, if you're teaching Black history, like you can talk about Bayard Rustin. But, you know, is there an issue with it? Like, you know, he did engineer the Civil March on Washington, right? You know, and I think that was always my cover. How can I do it in a way where it's aligned with the content, even if it is, to your point, Elena, talking about the identity of the person that did so. So at time, this is just such an incredible conversation. So I want to give it up to all the people that were on the panel, and certainly those of you who've been in the chat. Y'all have kept it real lit and exciting, and I certainly can't wait. I do want to just put in a pitch. We will be doing our Brave Education Summit nationally throughout the month of October, and I'm hoping to partner with Black on Black Education to actually present our Black Community Alliances portion, to be a panel or a workshop or something. So we want to hear, like, tell the people that have facilitated this, what are things that we didn't get to dig into as much that you'd like to go deeper into? And maybe this conversation can kind of be pre-work for a more deepened conversation moving ahead. So, Brother Jamal, do you want to close this out? I know he just kind of popped up real quick. Yes, thank you all. Jamal, Eva, do y'all, I don't want to just kind of have things end. So do y'all want to kind of come through, orient people to the rest of the conference? Okay, maybe somebody is gone. I do want to give a pitch to my shirt. It says Black Mental Health Matters. I know I've been sitting there and people saw black and mental, so yes, yes, our bios are there. Please reach out to us. I think most of us are on social media as well. This conversation can be something that you continue to have in your own spaces. So we encourage, although this was a national conversation, when you go back to your regions or your schools, like asking yourself, like, is our school, like do an audit on your school environment. Do we have people in our school who can be affirming to our students, right? You know, and how can we start to make that change? Thank you, Isabel. All right. Well, that's it. I'm sure they.
Thank you, Tim, for bringing us together.
Sorry, guys, my computer just like shut off. I didn't. Were you guys finished or were you still going?
We were waiting on you to kind of wrap it all up.
No problem. No problem. It's. I mean, I was in this session, so I thought it was incredible. I look forward. I mean, me and you have already talked to him, but I absolutely, look forward to talking to the rest of you guys and, highlighting the work that you guys are doing on, via Back on Black Education, because this was an amazing conversation. I grew up in a time where, we threw out a bunch of words and stuff that, we shouldn't have. And it's, I've had to grow as a person, so it helps to understand, what other people need to go through, because I've had to go through it. So I really appreciate you guys. You've taught me a lot. You've given me a lot to think about, and we definitely appreciate it. So anybody who is still here, you guys can jump back into some networking sessions. We are going to be back on at 3:10. And at 3:10, we will be hosting. It will be my daughter. I'm so happy. I get all choked up about these things. My daughter will be doing a panel with for student support and student activism and parent engagement. How do we support students' education and activism? How can parents engage with education to prepare their child in this coming year? And that's going to be Miss Christine Hendricks, Jordan Wise, Shauna Brown of Teach for the Culture, as well as Tammy Sawyer, and Eva will be moderating it. So you guys, feel free to hang out and check out the panel. Otherwise, you've done a phenomenal job, and we truly appreciate everybody's participation.
Thank you. Good to see y'all.
Peace, everybody.
This is like a reunion. Got to do it again soon. All right.
All right.
Thank you, Timon. I appreciate you. Bye-bye.
We definitely need to get together. Nice meeting you.